The first snow of the season had begun to fall, not in a gentle dusting, but in a hard, wind-driven sheet that promised to bury the world. Ilara watched it from the single window of her cabin, her arms crossed over her chest. She was a woman carved from the same hard timber as the mountains that surrounded her, her face planed by solitude and sorrow into something stark and unyielding. 29 years old, but the gray at her temples and the quiet in her eyes spoke of a life lived twice over. Her husband, Daniel, had been gone 6 years, claimed by a fever in a Tennessee field hospital she had tried and failed to command. She had been a nurse in the war, and the war had followed her home, not in nightmares of cannon fire, but in the steady, practiced silence of her hands. Those hands, calloused from chopping wood and tending her small garden, knew the language of wounds better than they knew the touch of another living soul. A thud against her door, heavy and final, was the only sound that broke the howl of the wind. It was not a knock. It was the sound of a body giving out. She did not startle. Her world was too small for surprises, only for events she must now attend to. She unbarred the thick oak door, pulling it inward against the force of the gale. A man lay sprawled on her porch, a dark stain spreading across the rough wool of his coat, stark against the fresh white of the snow. He was a stranger, his face turned away from her, half buried in a drift. His horse stood a few feet away, reins trailing, its breath pluming in the frigid air like a ghost. Ilara felt no fear, only a familiar, weary resignation. This was what the world brought to her door. Broken things. She knelt, the cold seeping through the knees of her woolen dress. Her fingers, deft and certain, found his neck. A pulse, thready and weak, but there. She hooked her arms under his, a grunt escaping her lips as she dragged his dead weight across the threshold. He was heavy, a solid man of muscle and bone, and the effort sent a jolt of pain through her own tired frame. She kicked the door shut with her heel, plunging the small cabin into the familiar fire-lit gloom. She rolled him onto his back on the rag rug before the hearth. The firelight danced over a face that was all sharp angles and stubbled jaw, etched with pain even in unconsciousness. He was not old, perhaps her own age or a little more, but hardship had left its mark in the lines around his eyes and mouth. The dark stain on his coat was centered on his left side, high on the chest. Blood. The coppery scent of it, sharp and unmistakable, cut through the smell of wood smoke and dried herbs. She did not hesitate. Her movements became a ritual she had performed 100 times before. She fetched her shears from the small wooden box that held her supplies. The shears were sharp, honed on a whetstone until they could part fabric with a whisper. She cut away the heavy coat, then the blood-soaked linen shirt beneath. The wound was ugly, a ragged, puckered hole just below the collarbone. It wasn't bleeding freely now, the cold having done some of her work for her, but the flesh around it was bruised a violent purple. It was a bullet wound, and the bullet was still inside. She knew this shape of injury intimately. She had seen it take her husband. For a single, fleeting moment, her hands trembled. Not from fear, but from memory. The image of Daniel, pale and sweating in a crowded, stinking tent, his chest bearing a wound just like this one. She closed her eyes, forcing the image away. He was gone. This man was here. She was a healer. That was all that mattered now. Her hands steadied. She placed a kettle of water over the fire to boil and laid out her tools on a clean cloth. A silver probe, a pair of forceps, her finest needle, and a spool of silk thread. She looked at the man's still face, the dark lashes resting on his pale cheeks. He was completely at her mercy. She would not fail him as she had failed the one she loved. The wind howled outside, a lament for the dying world, but inside, Ilara was preparing to fight for a life. The water hissed and bubbled in the kettle. Ilara poured some into a basin, adding a splash of whiskey that made the air sharp and clean. She took a clean rag, dipped it in the hot, stinging liquid, and began to clean the wound. The man groaned, a low sound from deep in his chest, and his eyelids fluttered. She paid him no mind. Her focus narrowed to the task. Her touch was firm, professional, wiping away the clotted blood and grime to reveal the true extent of the damage. The entry point was small, but the flesh around it was torn. The bullet had likely tumbled. Finding it would be difficult, removing it more so. She took the bottle of whiskey and knelt by his head. With one hand, she lifted his head slightly, and with the other, she pressed the mouth of the bottle to his lips. "Drink," she commanded, her voice raspy from disuse. His eyes, a startlingly clear blue, flickered open and met hers. They were filled with a haze of pain, but also a flicker of awareness. He coughed, then managed a shallow swallow. The raw spirit seemed to jolt him. He tried to push himself up on his elbows, his gaze dropping to his exposed chest and the woman leaning over him. "Lie still," she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. She pushed him gently but firmly back down. "You have a bullet in you. I am going to take it out." He stared at her, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He was taking her in. The severe braid of brown hair threaded with silver, the plain, dark dress, the absence of any softness in her expression. Most of all, he was watching her hands. They were not the hands of a delicate woman. They were strong, capable, the nails clipped short, the knuckles showing the hard work of her life. They were steady. He registered this fact with the part of his brain not consumed by the fire in his shoulder. Her hands were steady. He gave a short, sharp nod, his jaw tight, and let his head fall back onto the rug. He was placing his life in those hands. Ilara took up the slender silver probe. She had sterilized it in the boiling water and then in the flame of a candle, the metal still warm to the touch. "This will hurt," she said, not as a warning, but as a simple statement of fact. She saw the muscles in his jaw bunch, but he said nothing, just fixed his gaze on the low, timbered ceiling of her cabin. She took a deep breath, the scent of blood and whiskey filling her senses, and gently inserted the tip of the probe into the wound. He let out a long, slow hiss of breath through his teeth, but did not move. He was a man who knew how to take pain. She felt a grudging respect for him. She worked slowly, her touch impossibly delicate, feeling for the foreign object lodged in the tissue and muscle. The probe moved deeper, a terrible, intimate exploration. His body was rigid beneath her hands. She could feel the heat of his skin, the tremor of suppressed agony that ran through him. Her face was inches from his chest, her own breathing shallow as she concentrated, listening with her fingertips. Deeper, a little to the left. Then she felt it, the faintest metallic scrape. Click. The probe had found the bullet. It was lodged against the back of his clavicle, a dangerous and difficult place. She withdrew the probe carefully, marking the depth and angle with her thumb. She knew where it was. Now came the worst part. She picked up the forceps. "Hold still now," she whispered. The words meant as much for herself as for him. She widened the entry wound with a small, sharp blade, just enough to admit the instrument. A fresh wave of dark blood welled up, which she quickly sponged away. He grunted, his body arching off the floor for a moment, before he forced himself back down, his knuckles white where he gripped the edge of the rug. She slid the forceps into the path she had made, her eyes never leaving the wound. His gaze was on her face now, tracking the intense concentration in her eyes, the slight frown that creased the space between her brows. He saw no fear there, no revulsion, only a fierce, focused competence. It was a look he had seen on the faces of field surgeons in the heat of battle. He closed his eyes, trusting the look, trusting the steady pressure of her hands. Ilara felt the forceps close around the lump of lead. She had it, but it was wedged tight. She began to pull, a slow, steady traction. The man cried out, a raw, strangled sound that was torn from him against his will. Sweat beaded on his forehead. "Almost," she breathed. She braced her other hand on his sternum, using her own body as leverage, and pulled. There was a sickening give, a tearing of tissue, and the bullet came free. She dropped the mangled piece of lead into a metal bowl with a clatter. It was flattened on one side, misshapen. It had hit bone. He was lucky it hadn't shattered it. The man on the floor was panting, his face chalk white, his eyes squeezed shut. The worst was over. Ilara worked quickly now, her movements economical and sure. She poured more whiskey directly into the gaping wound. He roared this time, a full-throated sound of pure agony, and thrashed, but she held him down with surprising strength. "It's to stop the rot," she said, her voice still calm, still level. "Be still." He subsided, his body trembling with shock and pain. She took up her needle, already threaded with silk. Her stitches were small and neat, a practiced, even line that drew the ragged edges of the wound together. She had learned this skill on torn uniforms before she had learned it on men. The needle dipped and rose, a tiny silver fish swimming through the sea of his flesh. He watched her through half-lidded eyes, the pain receding into a dull, throbbing ache. He watched the way the firelight caught the silver in her hair, the way her brow furrowed in concentration. He watched her save his life, stitch by stitch. When she was done, she tied off the final knot and snipped the thread. The wound was closed. She covered it with a clean dressing of linen packed with dried yarrow to staunch any further bleeding. "It is done," she said, her voice soft with exhaustion. She sat back on her heels, the front of her dress spattered with his blood. He opened his mouth to speak, his throat raw. The first sound was a dry croak. He tried again, his voice a low rasp. What is your name?" It was a simple question, but it felt monumental, the first thread of connection woven in a room thick with pain and silence. She looked at him, truly looked at him as a person and not a wound, for the first time. His blue eyes were clear now, intelligent and watchful. "Ilara," she answered, the name feeling strange on her own tongue. She had not had cause to say it to a stranger in a very long time. "Ilara," he repeated, testing the sound of it. He pushed himself up on his good arm, hissing as the movement pulled at the fresh stitches. "I am Silas." He offered only the first name, a common currency in a land where a man's past was his own business. She simply nodded, accepting it. He looked down at the neat bandage on his chest, then back at her face. He saw the fatigue in her eyes, the faint tremor that now ran through her hands. The crisis having passed, he saw the blood on her dress. "I reckon I owe you my life," he said, his voice gaining some of its strength. "You owe me stillness," she corrected him, her tone brusque once more as she returned to the role of healer. You'll stay in that bed for 2 days. You will not move if you want my work to hold. You'll drink water and broth, nothing more." She gestured to a narrow cot in the corner of the room, piled with furs. "Can you make it there?" He nodded, his jaw set. He was not a man who liked to admit weakness. Getting to his feet was a clumsy, agonizing affair. The room tilted violently, and he swayed, his vision swimming with black spots. Before he could fall, she was there, her shoulder braced under his good arm, her body solid and unyielding as she helped him stumble the few feet to the cot. The brief contact was startlingly intimate. He could feel the warmth of her through his remaining clothes, smell the faint, clean scent of soap and wood smoke that clung to her. He collapsed onto the furs, boneless with exhaustion and pain. Ilara pulled a heavy bearskin over him, her movements efficient, impersonal. "Rest," she commanded, and turned away before he could say more. He watched as she moved about the small cabin, her shadow long and dancing in the firelight. She took the basin of bloody water and threw it out into the storm, the wind snatching it away. She cleaned her instruments with a practiced, methodical grace, returning each one to its proper place in the wooden box. She scrubbed her hands and arms with harsh soap until they were raw, washing away the evidence of his pain. She was erasing the violence, restoring her space to its former quiet. He was an intrusion, a disruption she was now managing. He drifted in and out of a feverish sleep, and every time he opened his eyes, she was there. Sometimes she was sitting in her chair by the fire, mending a tear in a piece of linen. Sometimes she was stirring a pot that sent a savory steam into the air. Once, in the deepest part of the night, he woke to find her standing over him, her hand cool on his forehead, checking for fever. Her touch was so light, so brief, he thought he might have dreamt it. But the concern in her shadowed eyes was real. A quiet recognition began to form in the haze of his pain. She was more than just a competent healer. She was a guardian, a silent watcher in the night. And for the first time since the ambush in the pass, Silas felt a flicker of something he had long forgotten: safety. He was a man accustomed to watching his own back, and now, in this stranger's cabin, he had someone else watching over him. The thought was as foreign and as welcome as the feeling of the bullet leaving his flesh. The second night was quieter. The storm had passed, leaving the world muffled and white under a thick blanket of snow. The fever that had gripped Silas broke in a drenching sweat sometime after midnight, leaving him weak but clear-headed. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting a soft red light on the small room. Ilara sat in her chair, not sleeping, but staring into the coals, a tin cup of what he guessed was tea held loosely in her hands. The silence between them was no longer the tense quiet of an emergency, but something deeper, more settled. "You learned that in the war," Silas said, his voice startlingly loud in the stillness. It wasn't a question. Ilara didn't turn. She continued to stare into the fire. "I did," she said, her voice low. "My husband was a surgeon's assistant. He taught me. Then he went to the front." She paused, and for a long moment, Silas thought she would say no more. When she spoke again, her voice was flat, devoid of emotion. "He took a ball in the chest at Shiloh, much like you. I was there, in the tent. But there were too many. The surgeon was drunk, and I was not what I am now." She took a sip from her cup. "He died. I learned to be better." The confession hung in the air, a stark and brutal summary of a life's turning point. He had asked for her story, and she had given him the hard, unvarnished truth of it in less than 50 words. It explained everything: Her skill, her solitude, the profound sadness that clung to her like a second skin. He waited, letting the silence honor her loss before he spoke. "Shiloh," he said, his own voice quiet. "I was at Shiloh, 2nd Iowa Infantry." Alara turned her head then, her eyes wide in the firelight. The professional mask she wore so well finally cracked. He saw a flicker of something raw and vulnerable in her gaze. "I was just a boy then," he continued, hauling water and digging graves. "I saw those tents. I heard the screaming. I smelled the rot." He looked at his bandaged chest. "I suppose God has a funny way of bringing things around." A single tear escaped her tightly controlled composure and traced a path down her cheek, glistening in the firelight. She wiped it away with the back of her hand, an angry, impatient gesture. It wasn't pity that made her weep, or even the shared memory of that terrible place. It was the simple, unexpected act of being seen. He had not offered condolences or platitudes. He had offered a shared piece of his own history, a quiet acknowledgement that he understood the hell she had forged herself in. His words were not meant to comfort, but they did. They made her past real, and her survival a thing to be witnessed, not just endured alone. "I'm a marshal," he said, deciding in that moment to give her more of the truth. "Was tracking a gang of outlaws, the Rawlins brothers. They robbed a bank in Dusty Creek, killed 2 men. We cornered them in the high pass. They were waiting for me." He gestured vaguely towards his wound. "They got the better of me. For a time." So, he was the law. That explained the steel in his spine, the way he held himself even when broken. It did not fit the image of a simple cowboy. She absorbed this new information, filing it away. A lawman. It made him both more dangerous and more respectable. It meant trouble was likely following him. "These Rawlins brothers," she asked, her voice steady again. "Will they come looking for you?" "They think I'm dead," he said. "They took my horse, my guns, left me in the snow. They'll be halfway to the territory line by now, thinking they're free and clear." He shifted on the cot, the movement less pained now. "I need to get to Fort Bridger. Send a wire." "You'll do no such thing," she stated, the healer taking over once more. "You'll stay here until that wound is closed and the danger of fever is past. Another week, at least." He started to protest, but she cut him off. "A man with a hole in his chest can't ride 20 miles through 2 feet of snow. You'll die, and my work will have been for nothing. You can be a marshal next week. This week, you are my patient." Her authority was absolute. He found himself, surprisingly, not minding it. He nodded, sinking back into the furs. The fire cast their long shadows against the log walls. A wounded lawman and a war widow, snowbound in a tiny cabin, their pasts tangled in a forgotten, bloody battleground. The world outside had vanished, and all that existed was this small, warm space, filled with unspoken things. He watched her for 3 more days. He learned the rhythms of her solitary life. She rose before dawn, her first task always to check on him. She would feel his forehead, inspect the dressing with an expert eye, her touch gentle but impersonal. Then she would tend the fire, fetch water from the creek she kept open with an axe, and prepare their meager meals. A thin broth for him, bread and dried meat for herself. She moved with a quiet efficiency, never wasting a step or a word. In the long afternoons, she would sit by the window, mending clothes or reading from a small, worn Bible, its pages as soft as cloth. He saw that she was not just alone. She was self-sufficient in a way that awed him. She had built a fortress of solitude, not of stone, but of competence. On the fourth day, she changed his dressing. As she carefully peeled back the linen, he saw her work for the first time. The wound was clean, the edges drawn together in a neat pink line, punctuated by her dark, even stitches. "You have a surgeon's hand, Alara," he said, his voice filled with genuine admiration. She paused, her fingers hovering over his skin. "My husband said I missed my calling," she replied, her voice soft. "He said I should have been the doctor." She finished her work, applying a fresh dressing. As she leaned over him, a lock of her hair, escaped from its severe braid, brushed against his cheek. The contact was electric, a spark in the clinical air between them. She pulled back as if burned, her cheeks flushing. It was the first time he had seen her color. That evening, he felt strong enough to sit in the cabin's other chair by the fire. The awkward proximity forced a different kind of conversation. "This land," he said, gesturing vaguely to the world outside the window. "Who does it belong to?" A shadow crossed her face. "It belongs to a man named Kane," she said, her voice tight. "Augustus Kane. Owns half the valley. I'm trespassing, I suppose. He doesn't know I'm here." Silas went very still. The name dropped into the quiet room like a stone into a deep well. Augustus Kane. His father. He had not used his full name. He had given her Silas, and she had taken it. He had not lied, but he had not offered the whole truth. He was Silas Kane, the second son of the cattle baron who owned this land, this mountain, the very ground her cabin was built on. He had run from that name years ago, choosing the simple justice of a marshal's badge over the complicated legacy of his father's empire. But the name had followed him. "You know him?" she asked, noticing his silence. Her eyes were sharp, missing nothing. He had a choice. He could keep the truth to himself, remain the simple lawman she had saved, or he could tell her and change everything. The trust she had given him, the quiet intimacy they had built in this small room, demanded the truth. "He's my father," Silas said, his voice flat. He watched her face, waiting for the reaction. Her expression didn't change, but he saw the light in her eyes harden, the wall of her solitude going up again, brick by invisible brick. She had dragged a wounded drifter into her home. Now she found he was the son of the man who could cast her out into the snow with a single word. "So," she said, her voice carefully neutral, "I saved the landlord." The words were not an accusation, but they held the weight of one. The fragile peace of their snowbound world was shattered. He was no longer just Silas, the patient. He was a Kane, and in this valley, that name meant power, a power she had spent years trying to live without. The fire crackled between them, the sound suddenly loud, accusatory. The tension in the cabin became a palpable thing, thick as the frost on the window pane. Alara moved with a brittle quiet, her conversations with him reduced to curt necessities about his wound and his food. She no longer sat by the fire in the evenings. She kept to the far side of the room, her back to him, as if his very presence was an encroachment. He was no longer a man she was healing. He was a symbol of the world that could undo her, a world of deeds, titles, and ownership. For his part, Silas felt the chasm that had opened between them. He wanted to explain, to tell her that he was not his father, that he had left that life behind for a reason. But the words felt hollow even in his own mind. How could he explain his rejection of a life of privilege to a woman who had nothing? The name Kane stood between them, a fortress far more impregnable than her cabin walls. He was testing his strength, walking the small perimeter of the cabin when he saw them. 3 riders, dark shapes against the blinding white of the snow, moving slowly up the trail toward the cabin. They were not lawmen. They rode with the weary slump of men who had been long in the saddle, their rifles held ready across their laps. Even from a distance, Silas recognized the middle rider by the distinctive red scarf he wore. Jeb Rawlins. They hadn't gone to the territory line. They had doubled back, perhaps looking for a place to hole up until the search for them died down. And they had found his trail. They had found Ilara's isolated, defenseless cabin. A cold dread, colder than the mountain air, settled in his gut. He was still weak, his gun arm stiff and aching. His pistol and rifle were gone, taken by these very men. They were 3, armed and desperate. He was 1, wounded and weaponless. He turned and went back inside, shutting the door quietly. Ilara looked up from the table where she was grinding herbs, her eyes questioning. "We have company," he said, his voice low and urgent. "The Rawlins brothers." Fear, sharp and immediate, flashed in her eyes. It was the first time he had seen her truly afraid, but it was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by a grim resolve. She glanced around the cabin, her gaze falling on the old hunting rifle mounted above the hearth. It was Daniel's. She hadn't fired it in 6 years. "Can you shoot?" she asked him, her voice a tight whisper. "Like breathing," he said, "if my arm will hold." She took the rifle down, her movements certain. She checked the action, her hands moving with a forgotten familiarity. She opened a small wooden box and took out a handful of cartridges, pressing them into his good hand. The rifle felt solid, real, a tool he knew how to use. The proximity of the threat had erased the distance between them. They were no longer landlord's son and squatter. They were 2 people in a box with wolves at the door. "There's a loose board under my cot," she said, her voice barely audible. "A root cellar. It's small, but they won't find you." She was offering him an escape, a way to hide while she faced them alone. He looked at her, at the fierce, desperate courage in her eyes. She was willing to face down 3 killers to protect him. In that moment, Silas made a choice. He could hide, save his own skin, and leave her to her fate. It was the sensible thing to do. But looking at Ilara, standing there with her chin set, her life's work of healing about to be undone by violence, he knew he couldn't. He had brought this trouble to her door. He would not abandon her to it. "No," he said, his voice firm. He chambered around in the rifle, the metallic snick echoing in the tense silence. "They're not here for you. They're here for me. We'll face them together." Her eyes searched his face, and what she saw there seemed to satisfy her, a flicker of a nod. An alliance forged in the face of death. The riders were closer now. They had stopped just beyond the clearing, surveying the cabin. "Stay away from the window," he hissed, pulling her back. "There's only one door. They'll come through it." He positioned himself in the darkest corner of the cabin, the long barrel of the rifle resting on the back of the chair she had been sitting in just moments before. His shoulders screamed in protest, but he ignored it. Adrenaline was a potent medicine. Ilara stood near the hearth, her hands clenched at her sides, her face pale but resolute. The first shout came from outside. "Hello, the house! We're peaceful men, just looking for a warm fire." It was Jeb Rawlins' voice, thick with false bonhomie. Silas didn't answer. Silence was a weapon, too. It bred uncertainty. Let them wonder who or what was inside. After a moment, A second, rougher voice called out. "We see the smoke. We know you're in there. Come on out, or we're coming in." Silas glanced at Alara. "When they break the door, get down," he mouthed. She nodded, her eyes fixed on the thick oak planks of the door. The minutes stretched into an eternity. The silence from the cabin seemed to unnerve the men outside. There was a low, muttered conversation, then the heavy crunch of boots in the snow approaching the porch. A heavy fist hammered on the door. Last chance. The wood groaned as a shoulder slammed against it. Then another, harder impact. The bar holding the door was thick, but it wouldn't hold forever. Silas sighted down the barrel of the rifle, his world narrowing to the small iron notch at its end. The door shuddered, a crack appearing near the latch. He took a slow breath, letting half of it out, just as he'd been taught. The world went still. There was only the door, the man behind it, and the choice he was about to make. The door burst inward with a splintering crash. For a heartbeat, the man who had kicked it in was silhouetted against the bright white light of the snow-covered world. It was all the time Silas needed. He squeezed the trigger. The roar of the rifle in the enclosed space was deafening. The man in the doorway was thrown backward, a dark stain blossoming on his chest, and he fell without a sound. The other two, stunned by the sudden violence, hesitated in the clearing. It was a fatal mistake. "The window!" Silas yelled at Alara. While the two remaining brothers were focused on the door, she had already moved, her mind working with the same quick, tactical clarity as his. She grabbed the heavy iron poker from the hearth, and in one fluid motion, smashed the single pane of glass in the cabin's only window. The cold air rushed in. Before the Rawlins brothers could react to this new threat, Silas was already there. Using the shattered window frame as a second firing position, he fired again. The second brother, who was raising his own rifle, spun around and dropped to his knees, clutching his leg. That left Jeb, the leader, the smart one. Jeb Rawlins didn't hesitate. He dove for the cover of the trees, firing a wild shot back at the cabin that thudded into the log wall near Silas's head. The game had changed. It was now a siege. Silas knew he couldn't afford a prolonged fight. He had limited ammunition, and his strength was already beginning to fail, the raw agony in his shoulder returning with a vengeance. He looked at Alara. She was crouched below the window, her face smudged with soot, her eyes wide but fearless. He had told her to get down, but she had not hidden. She had created a diversion, acted as a partner. She had chosen. "He'll wait for dark," Silas panted, reloading the rifle. "Try to burn us out." He knew how men like Rawlins thought. "Is there another way out?" Alara shook her head. "Only the door. The window is too small." They were trapped, but then Alara's eyes lit with an idea born of desperation and an intimate knowledge of her home. "The woodpile," she said. "It's stacked against the back wall. If we could move it?" Silas understood immediately. The back wall of the cabin was made of the same thick logs as the rest, but it was the one side not visible from the front. It was their only chance. But it would mean leaving the relative safety of the cabin and exposing themselves in the open. "He'll hear us," Silas said. "Not if we're quiet," she countered. "And not if you keep him busy." It was a desperate, foolish plan, and it was the only one they had. "All right," Silas agreed. "Go. I'll give you 5 minutes." He turned his attention back to the trees where Jeb Rawlins was hiding. "Rawlins!" he yelled, his voice echoing in the cold air. "It's over. Your brother is dead. The other one is gut-shot. Give it up!" It was a bluff, but it might buy her the time she needed. A shot rang out from the trees, splintering the window frame near his face. "You'll die in there, Marshal!" Rollins screamed back, his voice thin with rage and grief. The bluff had worked. It had confirmed his identity and focused Rollins' rage on him. While their deadly dialogue continued, Ilara was at the back of the cabin, working with a frantic, silent energy. She began to pull the heavy logs of firewood away from the wall, her muscles straining. The logs were frozen together, and each one she moved seemed impossibly loud. But the shouting match between Silas and Rollins covered the noise. She worked until her fingers were raw and bleeding, her breath coming in ragged plumes. Finally, she had cleared a small space. Behind the woodpile, just as she'd remembered, was a small, shuttered opening near the floor, used for ventilation in the summer. It was barely large enough for a person to squeeze through. She had her escape route. She scrambled back inside, just as Silas fired another shot into the trees to keep Rollins pinned down. "It's ready," she whispered, her chest heaving. He looked at her, then at the door, then back at her. He didn't have to say it. He went first. He was the target. He would draw the fire. It was the only way she would have a chance. The escape was a blur of frantic, agonizing movement. Silas pushed the last of his strength into a final volley of shots towards the trees, then scrambled to the back wall. Ilara was already there, holding the small shutter open. He pushed the rifle through first, then squeezed his body through the narrow opening, the rough wood tearing at his clothes and sending a fresh wave of fire through his wounded shoulder. He fell out into the snow, landing hard. He didn't wait. He grabbed the rifle and crawled for the cover of the woods behind the cabin, leaving a trail of blood in the snow. He heard Ilara's lighter form slide out behind him. They were out. They were exposed, but they were free from the coffin the cabin had become. They didn't run far, just deep enough into the thick pines to be hidden. From their new vantage point, they could see the front of the cabin and the tree line where Jeb Rollins was still hiding. The trap was now reversed. Silas settled into the snow, the cold seeping into him, and raised the rifle. He was a patient man. He had learned patience in the war, and he had honed it as a marshal. He would wait. The sun began to dip below the mountain peaks, painting the snow in shades of orange and purple. The cold deepened. Finally, seeing no movement and hearing no sound, Rollins grew bold. He crept from the cover of the trees, his pistol drawn, moving cautiously towards the silent cabin. He thought they were still inside, wounded or dead. He stepped into the clearing, a dark figure against the dying light. It was the last mistake he would ever make. The crack of Daniel's rifle was sharp and final in the twilight stillness. Jeb Rollins crumpled to the ground and did not move. Silence, absolute and profound, fell over the valley. It was over. In the aftermath, a different kind of quiet descended, one filled with the weight of what they had done, what they had survived. They did not speak. Silas, his energy utterly spent, slumped against a pine tree, the rifle slipping from his numb fingers. The adrenaline faded, and the pain in his shoulder returned, a throbbing, relentless tide. He was shivering violently, his teeth chattering. Ilara came to him and knelt in the snow. She looked at his pale face, the blue tinge to his lips. He had saved her, and in doing so, had nearly killed himself. She placed a hand on his cheek. His skin was like ice. Without a word, she began to unbutton his coat. He was too weak to protest. She worked with a clinical detachment that belied the intimacy of the act, pulling the heavy coat from his shoulders. Then she began to unbutton her own. "What are you doing?" he managed to ask, his voice a hoarse whisper. You're freezing, she said, her voice simple, direct. You need warmth, body warmth. She shed her own heavy outer coat and draped it over him. It was not enough. He was still shaking, the deep cold of shock setting in. She hesitated for only a second. Then she lay down in the snow beside him, pulling the heavy bearskin he had used on the cot, which she had managed to grab in their escape, over both of them. She pressed her body against his, her arms wrapping around him, trying to share her own life's heat. It was not a gesture of passion, but of pure, desperate preservation. He was a block of ice, and she was the fire. Under the heavy fur, in the deep blue twilight, she held him. He could feel the steady beat of her heart against his back. He could smell the scent of her hair, of wood smoke and of the wild, clean snow. The violent shivering began to subside. He was still in pain, still wounded, but he was warm. He was alive. He turned his head slightly, his lips brushing the fabric of her dress near her throat. Alara, he whispered, the name a prayer. She did not answer, but her arms tightened around him, a silent promise. In the vast, indifferent wilderness, under a dome of glittering stars, they lay together, two survivors clinging to each other, a tiny island of warmth in a world of cold. The choice had been made, not in words, but in this shared, desperate act of care. Weeks passed. The snows began to melt, revealing the first hopeful patches of brown earth. The wounded man in the clearing recovered his health, the one shot in the leg having surrendered and been taken to the fort by a patrol Silas was eventually able to summon. The bodies of the Rawlins brothers were buried in unmarked graves on a distant ridge. Their violence returned to the silent earth. Silas healed. The neat line of stitches on his chest became a puckered pink scar, a permanent reminder of the life he almost lost and the woman who saved it. He could have left. His duty was done, the outlaws brought to justice. A wire to the marshal's service would have brought him a new assignment, a new town, a new hunt. His father would have welcomed him back to the ranch. The prodigal son returned, ready to take his place. But he stayed, and he worked. He repaired the door he had helped to break. He replaced the window she had shattered for him. He chopped wood and stacked it high against the cabin wall, a bulwark against any future storms. He hunted, bringing back fresh meat to supplement their meager stores. He moved with the quiet purpose of a man who has found his place, not by birthright or by law, but by choice. The small cabin, once a fortress of solitude for one, slowly transformed into a home for two. The silence between them changed again. It was no longer the silence of strangers or of tension, or even of shared trauma. It became a comfortable quiet, the easy silence of two people who understand each other without the need for words. They learned each other's rhythms, the small habits of a life lived in close quarters. He learned that she hummed, a low, tuneless sound, when she was content. She learned that he whistled, a sharp, clear melody when he was thinking. One evening, as they sat by the fire, he reached out and took her hand. Her fingers were rough, the skin calloused, but her hand was small and warm in his. He turned it over and traced the lines on her palm with his thumb. "My father doesn't know about this cabin," he said, breaking the long silence on the subject. "But he will. The spring roundup will bring his men through this pass." She looked at him, her expression unreadable. "You should go," she said, her voice flat, "before they find you here, with me." "Is that what you want?" he asked, his blue eyes searching hers. She looked away at the dancing flames. "It's what's sensible," she said. I am a squatter on his land. You are his son. It is not a match the world will smile upon. I've never cared much for what the world thinks, he said softly. And I am not my father. He squeezed her hand. But you are right. He will find out, which is why I'm going to tell him. He paused, his gaze steady and serious. I'm riding to the ranch tomorrow. I'm going to tell him that this piece of land, this cabin, is mine now, that I've filed a claim, and that the woman who lives here is to be my wife. Ilara's head snapped up, her eyes wide with shock. A dozen protests rose to her lips, but they died when she saw the look on his face. It was not a question. It was a statement of intent, as solid and unyielding as the mountains around them. He was claiming her, just as he was claiming this land, not as a possession, but as his future. You are a fool, Silas Kane, she whispered, a smile finally touching her lips, the first genuine, unguarded smile he had ever seen from her. It transformed her face, erasing the years of sorrow and solitude. I know, he said, smiling back, but I'm your fool. He leaned in and kissed her, a gentle, reverent kiss that held all the unspoken promises of the weeks behind them and the years ahead. It was not a kiss of passion, but of profound, grateful recognition. A kiss that tasted of wood smoke and healing and home. Spring arrived in full, flooding the valley with green. The world was reborn. Silas returned from his father's ranch, his face grim but resolute. Augustus Kane had not been pleased, but he had not stood in his son's way. The deed to the 100 acres surrounding the cabin was in Silas's saddlebag. He had built a new, larger cabin a few yards from Ilara's, the fresh-cut pine logs smelling sweet in the mountain air. Her cabin, he explained, would be her infirmary. His first act as owner of the land was to give her a place to practice the skill that had saved him. People were already beginning to find their way to her. A ranch hand with a broken arm, a homesteader's wife with a fevered child. The story of the healer in the past who had faced down the Rawlins gang had traveled through the valley, growing with each telling. They called her a witch, some of them. But they came to her, all the same. One morning, a wagon rattled up the path. A young man, his face pale with panic, leaped down. "Please, ma'am," he cried, seeing Ilara standing on the porch of her new clinic. "It's my wife. The baby's coming, but it's turned wrong." Ilara did not hesitate. She grabbed the worn wooden box of her instruments. As she walked towards the wagon, Silas came out of the new cabin, a hammer in his hand. He stopped and watched her, a look of quiet pride on his face. He saw the woman the world saw, the healer, the witch, the survivor. But he also saw the woman only he knew. The steady hands that had trembled for a fleeting moment. The guarded heart that had wept at a shared memory. The fierce spirit that had chosen to stand with him. She was needed, and in being needed, she had found the one thing she had thought lost forever. She was not alone. She paused and looked back at him, a silent question in her eyes. He just nodded, a simple gesture that said, "Go. Do what you were born to do. I will be here when you get back." As she climbed into the wagon, she placed a hand on her own belly, where a new life had just begun to quicken. She was a healer, yes, but she was also a wife, and soon, a mother. The war had taken everything from her, and the wounded man who had collapsed on her doorstep had, in the end, given it all back.